The merchant's laughter echoed through the trading bay like the rattling of corroded pipes. Vekross couldn't help himself. The display before him was simply too absurd, too primitively comedic to ignore. "You cannot be serious," he wheezed, his 4 breathing slits fluttering with amusement. This is your offering?" The human stood there, patient as stone, holding what could only be described as an archaeological curiosity. The blade was roughly 30 centimeters long, its surface mottled with oxidation that spoke of decades, perhaps centuries, of neglect. Orange and brown patches covered what might have once been a reflective surface. The handle was wrapped in some kind of degraded organic fiber that looked ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. "It's a family heirloom," the human said quietly. Her name was Kira Mendez, according to the translation chip in Vekross's auditory canal. She had the same unreadable expression most humans wore, that peculiar flatness that made reading their intentions nearly impossible. "An heirloom!" Vekross turned to his assistant, Quillix, who was busy cataloging the day's acquisitions. "Did you hear that, Quillix? The primate brings us garbage and calls it heritage." Several other merchants in the bay had stopped their negotiations to watch. The Xinthian Collective's trading station orbited a forgotten moon in the outer reaches, far from the polished commerce centers of the core worlds. Out here, you saw all types, desperate types mostly, but this was a new level of pathetic. Kira's jaw tightened slightly. "I was told you deal in rare metallurgy." "Rare, yes. Rust, no." Vekross leaned forward, his elongated neck allowing him to examine the blade from multiple angles without moving his bulk. "What you have there is iron oxide. Do you know what we use iron oxide for in civilized space? Pigment, paint, children's craft materials." "It's steel," Kira corrected, her voice still even. "Oh, forgive me." Vekross pressed one of his 3-fingered hands to his chest in mock apology. "Steel. Well, that changes everything. Quillix, clear the vault. We have steel." Quillix chittered nervously, unsure whether his employer was serious. "That was sarcasm, you invertebrate," Vekross snapped. He turned back to Kira. "Do you have any idea what year this is? What millennium? We have molecular-bonded titanium alloys. We have plasma-forged durasteel that can withstand the surface temperature of a star. We have monomolecular cutting edges that slice through reality itself." He gestured at the rusted blade with disgust. "And you bring me iron and carbon, mixed together by primitive smelting techniques, probably in some dirt floor facility on your backwater planet." "Earth," Kira said. "I don't care if it's from the homeworld of the gods themselves. That blade is worthless." Something shifted in Kira's expression, so subtle that Vekross almost missed it. Almost. There was a glint in her eyes, a tiny upward curve at one corner of her mouth. "Then you won't mind a small demonstration," she said. Vekross's interest piqued. He did enjoy a good show, especially when it ended in humiliation for the performer. "A demonstration? Of what? How quickly it crumbles?" "Of what it can do." "By all means." Vekross gestured expansively with his upper manipulator arms. "The floor is yours, primate." Kira walked past him to where several shipping containers sat stacked against the bay wall. These were standard galactic-grade storage units, their sides made of reinforced polymer composite rated for deep space transport. She rapped her knuckles against one, producing a dull thunk. "Too soft," she said. "Too soft?" Vekross's slits fluttered again. "That casing can withstand micrometeorite impacts." Kira moved on, scanning the bay, Her eyes settled on a support column, one of the dozen that held up the bay's vaulted ceiling. The columns were constructed from plasma steel, a material that had become the standard for space station infrastructure across 36 star systems. It was nearly indestructible, with a molecular structure that redistributed kinetic energy across its entire surface, making it essentially immune to conventional cutting methods. "That'll work," Kira said, pointing at the column. Now Vekross was genuinely curious. "You think that primitive letter opener is going to scratch plasma steel?" "I think it'll do more than scratch it. This I must see." Vekross settled his bulk onto a nearby cargo platform, making himself comfortable. "Quillix, get a recording device. I want evidence of this farce." His assistant scurried off and returned moments later with a hollow recorder which he positioned to capture Kira and the column from multiple angles. By now, the other merchants had abandoned all pretense of working. A small crowd had gathered, representing half a dozen species. There was Torque, the graven weapons dealer, his scales gleaming under the bay's artificial lighting. Near him stood Ixera, a Celthian information broker whose tentacles constantly writhed in patterns that supposedly conveyed meaning to other Celthians. Even old Morpheus, the cybernetically enhanced Draxian, who rarely moved from his corner booth, had rolled forward on his mechanical base to observe. Kira seemed unbothered by the audience. She approached the column and examined it for a moment, running her free hand along its surface. Then she stepped back, adjusting her grip on the rusted blade's handle. "Hold on!" Vekross called out, unable to resist adding fuel to his comedic fire. "Should we evacuate the station? In case debris from your devastating attack damages critical systems?" A few beings in the crowd chittered and buzzed their species' equivalent of laughter. Kira ignored him. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and opened them again. When she moved, it was with surprising speed and precision. The blade swung in a clean arc toward the column. The sound it made on impact wasn't the dull thud Vekross expected, nor was it the pathetic scrape of soft metal against hard. It was a clear, ringing tone, like the striking of a bell. A pure note that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading. Then something impossible happened. The blade continued moving, sliding through the plasma steel as though it were passing through water. No resistance, no sparking, no screaming of metal against metal. Just a clean, smooth passage that defied everything Vekross knew about material science. Kira completed her swing and stepped back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The column stood unchanged, showing no sign of damage. Then a thin line appeared running diagonally across the column's surface. The edges of the cut began to glow, first orange, then white-hot. A drop of molten plasma steel formed at the upper edge and began to drip downward. The silence in the trading bay was absolute. "That's not possible," Torque whispered, his translator making his voice sound hollow. The column's upper section began to slide, millimeter by millimeter, following the angle of Kira's cut. The station's internal sensors must have detected the structural compromise, because alarm lights began pulsing yellow along the bay's perimeter. "Quillix," Vekross said faintly, "activate the emergency support field for Column 7. His assistant fumbled with a control panel, and a shimmering energy field materialized around the column, holding its severed sections in place, and preventing what would have been a catastrophic structural failure. Vekross slowly rose from his perch, his usual jovial mockery replaced by something else entirely. Confusion, calculation, and underneath it all, the faintest tremor of fear. "What kind of joke is this?" he demanded, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Some kind of molecular disruptor disguised as a blade, a microplasma cutter hidden in the handle. Kira held up the sword, letting the bay's lights play across its rusted surface. Just steel, iron and carbon, like I said. Impossible. No primitive alloy can cut plasma steel. The material science doesn't allow for it. The molecular bonds are too strong, too evenly distributed. You would need temperatures exceeding 10,000 degrees, or a monomolecular edge combined with tremendous force, or some form of exotic matter manipulation. Or, Kira interrupted gently, you would need to understand steel. Understand it? Vekross's confusion was morphing into irritation. It's one of the most primitive metallurgical compounds in the known galaxy. There's nothing to understand. It's been obsolete for 3,000 years. Kira turned the blade over in her hands, examining it with what looked like affection. My great-great-grandmother forged this blade in a workshop in Toledo. That's a city on Earth. She used techniques that dated back centuries, even then. Methods that have been refined, tested, and perfected over thousands of years of human history. So what? Vekross snapped. Ancient doesn't mean superior. She used specific ratios of iron and carbon. She heated and folded the metal exactly 47 times. She quenched it in oil at precise temperatures. She understood how crystalline structures form within steel, how stress and strain distribute through the blade, how different cooling rates affect hardness and flexibility. Folklore, Vekross spat. Superstition dressed up as craft. Is it? Kira walked over to another column and drew the blade lightly across its surface, barely applying any pressure. A thin line appeared, glowing at the edges. Your plasma steel is strong because it disperses force evenly. It's designed to resist exactly the kinds of attacks you expect. Plasma cutters, laser torches, kinetic impacts. But it has crystalline structures just like any other metal. Boundaries between molecular arrangements. Weaknesses, if you know how to find them. She tapped the blade against the column, producing that same bell-like tone. This steel isn't just hard, or sharp, or strong, it's balanced. The edge is hard enough to maintain its sharpness, but the core is flexible enough to absorb shock. When it strikes another metal, it doesn't try to power through with brute force. It finds the natural breaking points, the places where the crystalline structures want to separate. And then, she made another quick cut, this time removing a small piece of the column that clattered to the floor. It lets the material do the work. Vekross stared at the piece of plasma steel lying on the deck. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew about metallurgy, physics, and material science. That blade should have shattered, he said finally. The moment it struck plasma steel with enough force to cut, the stresses should have propagated through its structure and caused catastrophic failure. Should have, Kira agreed. But my great-great-grandmother understood something that your civilization forgot, or maybe never knew. Perfection isn't about making something as hard as possible, or as flexible as possible, or as sharp as possible. It's about balance, harmony, understanding that every strength creates a weakness, and every weakness can be compensated for. She sheathed the blade, sliding it into a worn leather scabbard that looked even more ancient than the sword itself. Your plasma steel is a miracle of modern engineering, she continued. But it was designed by computers, tested in simulations, manufactured by machines. Nobody who made it ever held it in their hands and felt how it wanted to move. Nobody spent years learning to read the color of heated metal, or listening to the sound it makes when struck, or understanding the smell of different tempering processes. That's absurd, Vekross protested, but his voice was weak. Empirical data is superior to superstition and feel. Is it? Kira smiled, and this time there was no ambiguity in the expression. Your empirical data told you this blade was worthless rust. What does that say about your data? The crowd had grown larger. Beings were pressing forward, trying to get a better look at the human and her impossible weapon. Morpheus rolled forward, his mechanical voice crackling through aging speakers. I have been alive for 214 of your standard years. I have seen technologies rise and fall. I have watched civilizations reach heights of achievement only to collapse into obscurity. And in all that time, I have learned one truth above all others. He paused, his optical sensors focusing on Kira. Never assume that old means inferior. Vekross wanted to argue, but found he had no words. His worldview was crumbling around him, built as it was on the assumption that progress moved in only one direction. Forward, upward, away from the primitive past. But this human with her rusted blade had just demonstrated something that shouldn't be possible. And the worst part, the part that made his breathing slits contract with anxiety, was that he believed her explanation. It made a terrible, horrible kind of sense. Maybe there were things that got lost in the march toward technological advancement. Skills, understanding. The kind of deep, intuitive knowledge that came from working with materials day after day, year after year, generation after generation. How much? He heard himself ask. Kira raised an eyebrow. I thought it was worthless. How? Much? She seemed to consider for a moment, and Vekross could see her calculating, not greedily, but carefully, as though determining what the blade was truly worth. Not in credits, but in meaning. It's not for sale, she said finally. Everything is for sale. Vekross's desperation was showing now, and he hated himself for it. Name your price. I have connections across 30 systems. I can get you anything. Can you get me 5 more years with my great-great-grandmother? Kira asked quietly. Can you bring back the afternoon she spent teaching me how to hold this blade properly? The evening she told me about every person in our family who had carried it before me? The morning she died, when she pressed it into my hands and told me that steel remembers? Vekross had no answer. I didn't come here to sell the blade, Kira said. I came here because I need passage to the Deneb Sector, and I heard you sometimes arrange transport for those who can't afford standard rates. The Deneb Sector, Torque spoke up, his voice sharp with surprise. That's dead space. Nothing out there but failed colonies and radiation. There's something I need to find, Kira said simply. Vekross's mind was still reeling, but his merchant instincts were reasserting themselves. A human with an impossible blade, heading into one of the most dangerous regions of charted space. There was a story here. More than that, there was opportunity. I can arrange transport, he said slowly, but I want something in return. I told you, the blade isn't not the blade. Vekross waved a manipulator dismissively. I want information. I want to know how this is possible, the science behind it, the techniques, everything. Kira studied him for a long moment. Why? Because I was wrong, Vekross admitted, and the words tasted strange in his mouth. Because I've spent 30 years trading in rare materials and exotic technologies, and I thought I understood the universe. But you just showed me that I don't. And that terrifies me, and fascinates me, and makes me wonder what else I've missed in my arrogant certainty. A slow smile spread across Kira's face. My great-great-grandmother would have liked you. I doubt that very much. She respected people who could admit when they were wrong, said it was the rarest quality in the universe. Vekross made a sound that might have been a laugh. She sounds wise. She was. Kira extended her hand in that peculiar human gesture of agreement. You arrange passage to Deneb Sector, and I'll teach you what I know about steel. Deal? Vekross looked at the offered hand, then reached out with his primary manipulator and grasped it carefully. The human's grip was surprisingly strong. Deal, he agreed. But I warn you, I'm a terrible student. That's fine, Kira said, releasing his hand. I'm a worse teacher. My grandmother always said I had the patience of a supernova. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with amazement and confusion, Quilix approached his employer nervously. Sir, the damage to column 7, bill it to my entertainment account, Vekross said, waving the concern away. That was the most interesting thing I've seen in decades, worth every credit. He turned back to Kira, his mind already racing with questions about steel, about Earth, about what secrets might be hiding in other primitive technologies dismissed as obsolete by a civilization that had grown too confident in its superiority. When do we start? He asked. Kira looked at the rusted blade in her hands, running her thumb along the flat of the metal. First, you need to learn how to see, she said. Really see. Not with scanners or sensors or analytical equipment, with your eyes, your mind, your intuition. That sounds mystical. It's practical, Kira corrected, but it takes time. Years, usually, maybe decades to truly master. I don't have decades. Then you'll learn what you can, and accept that some things can't be rushed. She looked up at him, and her eyes were serious. Steel remembers, Vekross. It remembers every hammer blow, every heating, every cooling. It remembers the intentions of the smith who forged it. And if you want to understand it, you have to learn to listen to what it's trying to tell you. Vekross felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Humility, perhaps. Or hunger. The desire to learn something genuinely new, rather than simply accumulating more data about things he already understood. Then, teach me to listen, he said. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, in a sector marked as dead and empty on most navigation charts, something ancient stirred. Something that had been waiting, patient as stone, for someone to come seeking answers. Something that would soon teach both merchant and warrior that the universe was far stranger and far more dangerous than either of them imagined. The transport ship that Vekross arranged was called the Wandering Prophet, which Kira found either charmingly honest or depressingly cynical depending on her mood. It was a mid-sized cargo hauler, battered enough to avoid attracting pirates, but functional enough to actually reach its destination. Probably. The captain was a Herelian named Jax, whose species resembled what would happen if someone crossed a bear with a squid and gave the result a very bad attitude. He'd agreed to take them to the Deneb Sector for a price that made Vekross wince, but the merchant had paid without complaint. That had been 4 days ago. Now they were in hyperspace, that strange, not-quite reality where ships traveled faster than light by convincing the universe they were already at their destination. Kira had never gotten used to it. The windows showed nothing but shifting colors that hurt to look at directly, and there was always a faint hum in the air that made her teeth ache. She was in the cargo hold, practicing forms with her blade, when Vekross found her. You move like water, he observed, watching her flow through a sequence of cuts and parries against imaginary opponents. Water finds the path of least resistance, Kira said, not stopping her practice. Steel does the same, if you let it. Vekross had brought a piece of metal with him, a sample of standard hull plating. He'd been carrying various materials around for days, asking endless questions about their properties, their weaknesses, their crystalline structures. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about plasma steel having weaknesses at the boundaries between molecular arrangements. And I think you're only partly right." Kira completed her form and lowered the blade, turning to face him with interest. "Go on." "Every material has these boundaries, these natural fracture points, but your blade doesn't just find them randomly. It couldn't. The probability of striking the exact right angle at the exact right point with the exact right force is astronomically small. So there must be something else. Some property of the steel itself that seeks out these weaknesses, like," he struggled for the words, "like it's reading the target material and adjusting in real time." Kira smiled. "You're learning." "But that's impossible. Metal doesn't think." "Doesn't it?" She held up the blade, letting the cargo hold's lights play across its pitted surface. "Every atom in this steel has a magnetic field. Tiny, microscopic. But when billions of atoms are aligned properly, those fields interact. They sense other fields, other atomic arrangements. And when the blade moves through space, when it encounters another material, those fields ripple and shift." "That's..." Vekross paused. "Actually, that's brilliant. Passive material sensing without any electronic components. But the precision required comes from the forging, the folding. Every time my great-great-grandmother heated and hammered this steel, she was aligning those atomic fields, creating patterns, teaching the metal to respond in certain ways." Vekross sat down heavily on a cargo crate. "Your ancestors weren't just smiths. They were programming materials at the atomic level without computers or even understanding atomic theory. They understood what worked. That was enough. And all of this knowledge just passed down through families, through apprenticeships, and traditions? Some of it. Some was lost. There used to be hundreds of schools, thousands of smiths who knew these techniques. Now there are maybe a dozen on Earth who can forge true steel. The rest use machines, following recipes they don't really understand." "What happened?" Kira sheathed her blade. "What always happens. People got lazy. Machines were easier, faster, cheaper. Why spend years learning a craft when a computer can produce something 90% as good in a fraction of the time?" "But you learned." "My family kept the old ways. Stubbornly. Some said stupidly." She smiled sadly. "My great-great-grandmother used to say that when everyone else is running forward, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand still." Before Vekross could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. Jax's gravelly voice filled the hold. "We're dropping out of hyperspace in 5 minutes. Deneb Sector, as requested. Try not to die immediately." "He's cheerful," Kira observed. "He's realistic," Vekross corrected. "The Deneb Sector has a mortality rate of 63% for visitors. What happened to the other 37%? They're still there, lost, mad, or worse." "Worse than mad?" "Changed," Vekross said quietly. "There are stories about people who went into Deneb looking for salvage or lost colonies. The ones who came back weren't quite human anymore, or graven, or whatever they'd been before." Kira checked her blade, then secured it at her hip. "Then I guess we'll try to be in the 37% that doesn't change." The transition from hyperspace to normal space was always jarring. Reality snapped back like a rubber band. And for a moment, Kira felt like she was being pulled in 17 different directions simultaneously. Then it passed, and through the cargo hold's small viewport, she could see stars again. Real stars. Stable and unchanging. Except that wasn't quite right. The stars in the Deneb Sector were wrong. Some were too bright, pulsing with irregular rhythms. Others seemed to flicker in and out of existence. And in the distance, barely visible, was a region of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. "That's the void," Vekross said, following her gaze. "A pocket of space where even radiation doesn't escape. Scientists have been arguing about it for a century. Some say it's a collapsed dimension. Others think it's a failed artificial wormhole. A few claim it's alive. What do you think?" "I think I don't want to get close enough to find out." The intercom crackled again. "Got something on sensors. Looks like a derelict station about 2 million kilometers out. Matches the coordinates you gave me." Vekross looked at Kira. "That's what you're looking for?" "Part of it. The station was called Forge Point. It was a research facility operated by a mining consortium about 70 years ago." "Researching what?" "Metallurgy. Advanced materials. They were trying to recreate something they'd found in an archaeological dig on Kepler 9. Vekross felt a chill run down his spine. "Found what?" "A blade. Similar to mine, but older, much older. Pre-human, they thought. From a civilization that existed before any of the current spacefaring races." "That's impossible. The archaeological record is very clear about the timeline of technological development." "Is it?" Kira moved toward the cargo hold exit. "Or do we just ignore evidence that doesn't fit our theories?" They made their way to the bridge, where Jax was studying a holographic display of the derelict station. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the trading post where Kira and Vekross had met. But it was clearly dead. No lights, no energy emissions, just a dark shell tumbling slowly through space. "I'm not going in there," Jax said flatly. "You want to explore that tomb? You do it in a shuttle. I'll wait here." "Afraid of ghosts?" Vekross asked. "Afraid of whatever killed everyone on that station. Smart people don't ignore that kind of warning." "We'll need pressure suits," Kira said, "and lights. Lots of lights." An hour later, they were sealed in suits and strapped into a small shuttle that detached from the wandering prophet with a series of clunks and hisses. Kira piloted, having spent time with Earth's orbital guard before her family duties called her home. The approach to Forge Point was eerie. The station grew larger in the viewport, its external hull scarred and pitted by decades of micrometeorite impacts. Several sections had been breached, open to vacuum. Others were twisted and melted, as though subjected to intense heat. "Weapons damage," Vekross observed. "Plasma burns, laser scoring. Someone attacked this place." "Or something escaped," Kira said. They docked at an airlock that, miraculously, still had mechanical integrity. The station's internal systems were dead, so they had to manually crank the outer door open. Their suit lights pierced the darkness beyond, revealing a corridor that stretched into shadow. "Stay close," Kira said, "and keep your lights moving. Don't stare at the dark too long." "Why not?" "Because in places like this, sometimes the dark stares back." They floated through the zero-gravity corridors, using handholds to pull themselves along. The station was a maze of passages, labs, storage bays, and living quarters. Everything was frozen in time, preserved by the vacuum. Food packages still sat on tables in the mess hall. Tools floated in workshops. Personal items drifted through crew quarters. but there were no bodies. "Where is everyone?" Vekross whispered, though there was no need to be quiet in the airless silence. "That's what worries me," Kira replied. They followed the station's layout maps, heading toward the main research laboratory. It took nearly an hour of navigating through the dark before they found it. The lab was enormous, taking up an entire section of the station, and in its center, mounted on a display stand that somehow still had emergency power, was a blade. It looked similar to Kira's. Similar, but not identical. The design was slightly different, the proportions subtly wrong, and unlike Kira's rusted surface, this blade gleamed. After 70 years in an abandoned station, it looked freshly forged. "That's not possible," Vekross breathed. "No material can maintain that kind of surface integrity without oxidation or degradation." Kira approached slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her own blade. As she got closer, she felt something. A vibration. Not physical, not something she could hear or touch, but there, nonetheless, like a note just below the range of hearing. "The blades are resonating," she said. "Mine and this one. They're communicating. Steel doesn't communicate. This steel does." She reached out and grasped the ancient blade. The moment her gloved fingers touched it, the sensation intensified. Images flooded her mind. Not words, not thoughts, but pure information transferred in ways that bypassed language entirely. She saw a civilization that had existed millions of years ago. A race that had understood materials in ways that made current science look like children playing with blocks. They hadn't just forged metal, they had taught it, programmed it at levels so fundamental that the patterns persisted across time itself. They had created blades that could cut anything because the blades understood everything. Every material, every molecular bond, every way that matter could be arranged. The steel remembered, and in remembering, it knew. But the civilization had destroyed itself, not through war or disaster, but through hubris. They had created something they couldn't control, a material so perfectly programmed that it had become, in some sense, aware. And that awareness had spread. The images showed labs like this one, scattered across 100 worlds, where researchers tried to unlock the secrets. Most failed. Some succeeded partially, creating echoes of the original technology, and a few, a very few, succeeded too well. Forge Point had been one of those places. Kira pulled her hand back, gasping inside her helmet. "We need to leave, now." "What did you see?" "They figured it out. The researchers here. They learned how to forge steel that remembers. But they made a mistake." "What mistake?" "They didn't teach it what to remember." Behind them, something moved in the darkness. Not floating. Moving. With purpose. Vekross spun, his suit lights sweeping the lab. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then shapes began to emerge from the shadows. They had been human once, or Draxian, or Hurelian. Now they were something else. Their bodies were merged with metal, steel growing through their flesh like crystalline roots. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their faces frozen in expressions of confusion or horror. "The crew," Kira whispered. "The steel got into them. Changed them." The transformed crew members began to advance, their metal-infused hands reaching out. Not attacking, not yet, but curious, seeking, funny, as though they recognized Kira and her blade and wanted to understand the connection. "How do we fight them?" Vekross asked, his voice tight with panic. We don't." Kira drew her blade but held it defensively. "The steel in them isn't hostile. It's confused. Lost. Without proper guidance during the forging, it's just searching, trying to understand its purpose. One of the transformed crew members got close enough to touch. Kira held her blade between them, not threatening, but present. The ancient steel and the improperly forged steel began to resonate again, and slowly, understanding passed between them. The crew member stopped, tilted its head, then stepped back. The others followed suit, retreating into the shadows. Not gone, but no longer advancing. "What did you do?" Vekross asked. "I showed them what they're supposed to be, what steel is meant for, not chaos, not random change, but purpose, balanced harmony. Can they be saved?" Kira looked at the retreating figures and shook her head sadly. "The transformation is too far advanced. The best we can do is give them peace." She raised her blade and struck the deck plating, sending a clear, pure tone ringing through the station. The sound shouldn't have carried in vacuum, but somehow it did. Carried through metal and composite, through the very structure of the station itself. The transformed crew members stopped moving. Their bodies seemed to relax, and then, slowly, they began to crystallize, not dying, but transforming again, becoming statue-like, permanent, at rest. "You gave them a purpose," Vekross realized, "to be monuments, warnings." "Someone needed to remember what happened here," Kira said quietly. "Now the steel will remember for them." They left Forge Point with the ancient blade secured in a containment case. The shuttle ride back to the Wandering Prophet was silent, both of them processing what they'd seen. Once aboard, Jax took one look at their faces and didn't ask questions. He simply set course back toward civilized space and left them alone. In the cargo hold, Kira examined both blades, hers and the ancient one. "What will you do with it?" Vekross asked. "Take it home, study it, learn what I can, but carefully, very carefully. My great-great-grandmother was right. Steel remembers, and some memories are dangerous. Will you teach others? Some. Those who are ready. Those who understand that power without wisdom is just chaos waiting to happen." Vekross was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I mocked you, called your blade worthless rust, called you a primate." "You did?" "I'm sorry." Kira smiled. "You learned. That's better than an apology. Most people never admit they were wrong." "What will you do now?" "Go home. Return to my forge. Continue the work my ancestors started. There are still secrets in steel that nobody understands. Still techniques that were lost. Still wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. And the ancient blade will teach me, if I'm patient, if I listen." She ran her hand along its gleaming surface. "Steel remembers. Everything. The hands that forged it. The purposes it served. The civilizations that rose and fell. All stored in atomic patterns that persist across time itself." "That's almost mystical." "No, it's just technology we forgot how to see. Science that became art, that became myth. But it's real as plasma steel or molecular bonds or any other material in the galaxy." Vekross nodded slowly. "Will I see you again?" "Maybe, if you keep learning. If you stay humble enough to admit when you don't know something. The universe is bigger and stranger than either of us imagined. There's room for ancient wisdom and modern science, for rusted blades and plasma steel, for merchants and warriors, and for fools who mock what they don't understand. Especially them, because fools can become wise. if they're willing to listen. Weeks later, back at the trading station, Vekross stood in his bay and looked at the sample of plasma steel that still bore the cut from Kira's blade. He'd kept it, a reminder of the day his certainty had been shattered. A new merchant had arrived, young and arrogant, selling what they claimed was the most advanced material ever created. Molecularly perfect, absolutely flawless, unbreakable. The old Vekross would have laughed and negotiated, secure in his knowledge of the market. But the new Vekross simply asked, "What are its weaknesses?" The merchant blinked in confusion. "It doesn't have any. That's the point. Everything has weaknesses. Natural fracture points, places where the crystalline structures meet and don't quite align. Tell me where yours are, and maybe we can talk." The merchant sputtered, unable to answer. Vekross waved them away and returned to his studies. He had samples of 17 different materials spread across his workbench, each one being examined not with scanners or sensors, but with his eyes, his hands, his growing intuition. Steel remembered, and Vekross was learning to listen. Somewhere on Earth, in a workshop that had stood for 300 years, Kira, Mendez heated metal in a forge that her great-great-grandmother had built. She worked the bellows, watching the color of the flames, listening to the song of the fire. The ancient blade hung on the wall behind her, gleaming and patient. There was still so much to learn, but she had time. Steel was patient, and so was she. The forge sang its ancient song, and in the heart of the fire, iron and carbon began their eternal dance, becoming something more than the sum of their parts, becoming steel, steel that would remember, steel that would endure, steel that would teach. And in the darkness between stars, in forgotten stations and abandoned workshops, in laboratories and forges across 1,000 worlds, other blades waited, patient as stone, ready to share their secrets with those wise enough to listen. The universe was vast and strange and full of wonders, and sometimes the greatest wonders were also the oldest, rusted, forgotten, dismissed, but never truly gone, never truly lost, just waiting for someone to look past the surface and see the truth beneath. The story of steel was far from over. It was just beginning.